with all of you. It's always a little strange for me to speak to a Zoom room full of, black boxes. But I'm very excited to be here with all of you. I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about, hi Jenny, thank you for turning on your camera. It's I started writing this book, The Grand Paloma Resort, right at the outset of the pandemic, the 2020 pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. At that time, my journey to publish my first book, Neruda on the Park, was a 15-year journey. And so I had been working full time in an insurance company where I was an executive. I'd gotten married and had two children. So I had lived a lot of life during times when I was writing my debut. I took years off from writing the debut. And so it was kind of odd that right as my literary agent and I were ready to go to market with the book, the pandemic happened and just brought the publishing industry to a complete halt. And so, as you can imagine, I was like, of course, devastated because we're going through this big pandemic. But then, of course, I'm also feeling personally devastated because I thought, here I go after like almost 2 decades of working on this book, we're finally able to try to sell it. And it just didn't seem like it would happen. And so, at that point, I really had been pretty tough with myself. Like I refused to write anything other than that book. And just around that time, a very dear friend of mine had written to me and said, I'm guest editing a literary journal. Do you have any short stories that you could send? And I was just thinking how wild it would be if I finally gave in to this desire I had to write. I had been thinking about writing a collection of short stories that all took place in the Caribbean, in the Dominican Republic, where I was born, and would all be centering really the lives of these employees at this resort. And so, one of the things that I learned, hi, Sabe, that's my friend. One of the things that I learned, because I had been, I had gotten my MFA as I was working full time, was that when somebody invites you to do something, you just say yes and you do it. Okay. So even if you don't feel like you're quite ready, you just have to kind of bet on yourself. And so at the outset of the pandemic, I decided I'm going to just start writing these stories. And I knew that the stories would be centering these employees. I had been thinking about the employees for a very, very long time. And so I was in my own mind, I had been kind of like traversing this resort and spending time with a lot of these characters, even though I hadn't started writing the stories yet. And so I did. I wrote, a very short story. If you go on my website, you can find the original story that I first published in the Kenyan Review. And that one, I think it's now chapter 4 in the novel, where Vida Curandera is beckoned to come to the resort because a tourist child has been injured. And so that was kind of the first story that I wrote. And then, I was really interested in writing a love story. At the time, I thought I was going to write a love story. And so the second story I wrote was Pablo, Vida's boyfriend, who also worked at the resort. And Pablo has, he's a fisherman, he's, a bartender, and he also has like a quite inappropriate relationship with some of the guests at the resort. And so like the reason that Vida and Pablo had broken up was because Vida found out that he was doing quite inappropriate things with some of the guests. And so one of the interesting things that happens when we start writing fiction is that sometimes the story surprises us. And so what happened to me when I started writing this book is that when the curandera shows up to the resort because there's a crisis and a young child, tourist child, has been injured, she finds out that, this young babysitter, Elena, is responsible. She was being, neglectful, and she's kind of responsible for what happened. And then Elena's older sister, who is also an employee at the resort, we find out that she's middle management and she's quite tough on her younger sister. And so it was just really interesting for me because when I thought I was going into this book to write this kind of love story, like the protagonist would be a couple, I very quickly realized that the protagonists were not going to be this couple, that the protagonists were going to be the two sisters. And so, what I decided to do today in terms of like presenting the book to you is that I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning of the book. And then I'm going to give you a taste of, one of the other employees in the resort so that you can kind of get a taste of how the book moves. And so as a way to set up the book, you should know that, the Grand Paloma Resort, my publisher gave me this poster and I sometimes forget that there's like a giant copy of it behind me. So it takes place over the course of 1 week. So it's a 7-day escape. So, you come into the resort, you're with these employees over the course of 7 days. The story is centrally concerned with the two sisters, Elena and Laura, who are both employees at the resort. We found out pretty early on that they lost their mother when they were quite young. So Laura, who's 27 years old, took on more of a mother role with her younger sister, Elena, who's 17. And then what else should you know? You should know that the plot of the book is really around this idea of escalating crises that stem from the disappearance of two local girls. So I'm just gonna start reading now, and then I'm gonna read a couple of different sections of the book, and then we'll open it up to all of you. And I know that most of you haven't read the book. But I'm always happy to talk about my journey, from corporate America to becoming a full-time writer and an academic, which, I now teach at Montclair State, like Dr. Mungor said. Yeah, I'm just happy to talk about any questions you might have, or I can tell you more. I mean, I can talk all day. So I'm also happy to talk to you about, my adventures and the kinds of things I've learned about trying to stand up a writing career, because I know it's quite difficult for those of us who are interested in writing fiction. So I'm gonna start reading for you from just the very first chapter of the book. And the book actually opens with like a letter from the hotel to the guests who are checking in, and I'm not gonna read that letter. But all you need to know is that letter just kind of like lets you know that this is a very luxurious resort, that it is the safest resort in the Dominican Republic, and that no accident has ever happened there. There's been no violence whatsoever. And so, of course, I already told you what happens in chapter 1, which is that that reputation is at risk. The tourist child's mud-streaked body had become heavy, and sweat made her slippery in Elena's arms. As she made her way out from the tropical forest behind the Grand Paloma Resort, Elena headed not in the direction of the manicure grounds, but into the water-starved, cracked dirt of the staff quarters. Looking down at the little girl's unconscious form, she whispered, "Please, please, please don't die on me." I think Jennifer, your thing is not muted. Okay, thank you. She wove through row after row of beautiful casitas, alternating vibrant turquoise and the brightest yellow, with a flash of hot pink every fourth or fifth little house, each decorated with flower beds full of birds of paradise and lilac hibiscus bushes. It was the kind of sight that would make a visitor sigh in delight, unless they happened to touch the plants and realize they were made of plastic. Nothing got water in this part of the resort. Once she was safely inside the casita she shared with her older sister Laura, Elena took a breath and looked around, unsure whether to lay the child on her bed or her sister's bed. Relief washed over her. No one had seen her. It was as if the dusty ground of that forest had lifted and shrouded her. She was paralyzed momentarily by the weight of the child's body. What was she, 60 pounds? 200? Elena was dizzy from the heat and humidity. She'd been hired to care for the now injured and unconscious tourist child, looking after the girl by day and sleeping in a tiny, cat-sized room in the back of the kitchen of the penthouse suite that the girl and her parents occupied. Elena hadn't been in the casita all week. Her side of Her side of the casita was messy as she left it. Unmade bed, strewn clothes, shoes everywhere. It was shocking. Her sister always cleaned up after her. Elena laid the kid on Laura's neatly made bed. She called the girl's name and shook her gently. No response. The blonde, bouncy curls that had swayed when they tried the latest viral TikTok dance that morning before their outing in the forest were matted with mud and blood. The kid's flat chest seemed too still. Had it been a mistake, moving the child? Elena caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror. Her dark brown skin shone from the effort of carrying this kid. The bald head that she'd shaved to celebrate her freedom from the Global Academy, from the confines of this place, appeared oversized. The big eyes that everyone always complimented her on were full of tears. The slender frame she worked hard at, swimming 2, sometimes 3 times a day when she wasn't charged with full-time work as a babysitter, made her seem fragile, prepubescent. She was 17, but looked like a 14-year-old. The pink scrubs that identified her immediately to all guests as a babysitter exaggerated that image, softening her. She worked hard to appear revolutionary, but now look at her, a terrified kid. Elena sat on the bed to take a breath. She was comforted by the smell of her sister's woody perfume. Laura's row of white uniforms, which denoted her rank as part of the senior leadership team of the hotel's management, was rigid in the closet. On her sister's night table was Elena's final paper, the one she'd written just 2 months ago as a requirement for graduation from the international high school, the case against statelessness. Her teacher had said it was great writing, but had predictable conclusions. The questions you ask are important, her teacher has said. Truly excellent. But what about resolutions? Is there a way through? Still, Elena had gotten an A. The walls of the casita were decorated with posters from the cities the sisters wished one day to visit together: London, New York, Milan, Paris. Elena called her sister, who didn't answer her cell phone. Elena called again and again and again. Laura finally answered. "I'm busy, Elena," she said sharply, then hung up. Elena knelt next to the bed. She kissed the little girl's forehead, tasting the coppery mountain mud. There was a bit of sweetness in it. She remembered how warm the mud had been when she'd first suggested they should do mud masks. The kid's skin didn't feel warm anymore. It felt clammy, cold. Something was changing. The mud had dried and crusted on her skin. The girl's eyelids fluttered. Elena held her breath as it seemed she was on the cusp of opening her eyes. But then the kid seemed to grow more still, tiny red and blue veins becoming more pronounced beneath the soft, almost transparent skin of her eyelids. Elena reached inside the pocket of her pants. She found the last yellow ecstasy pill she'd been holding on to, which she had planned to chew later when she took the kid to the beach. She had taken another pill just like it when they were deep in the forest, crunching it between her teeth, swallowing the grimy texture, tasting that bitterness that coated her tongue. When the kid fell, Elena had been outstretched on the dry dirt, glad that the feeling of hopelessness seemed galaxies away. As the cielo brand seemed to promise, she'd felt like she was floating in the sky, but she'd also been fully present in her body, marveling at the beauty of the trees that canopied them in a warm glow, humming with the glorious vibration of interconnectedness. They were a part of everything. Harmony was within reach. Elena was tempted to take this pill now to escape this terrible situation, but she knew that was a bad idea. She was coming down from her high. She would take this pill later, save it as a reward for when she figured a way out of this circumstance. Holding the pill made her feel bold, brave, time to act. Elena called her friend Pablo, praying he'd pick up the phone on the first ring. Dímelo, loca, Pablo said, laughter lacing his tone. What did you do now? Elena felt indignant at the way Pablo stressed the word now. She realized that calling Pablo for help was a bad idea. She needed her sister. Do you have any more of the yellow pills? She asked instead. Muchacha, what's wrong with you? Not on the phone. Swing by if you want. I'm descaling the fish. Pablo hadn't mentioned it, so apparently the parents of the unconscious girl hadn't yet rung an alarm, demanding to know what the hell had happened to their 8-year-old child. Elena supposed that, like most people who visited the Grand Paloma Resort, to forget their boring, rich lives, to experience something shocking and surprising, maybe even transcendental, the unconscious girl's parents were sitting by the pool in the stifling August heat to burn their skin, to get that delicious, tingling feeling that eventually raised their body temperatures, that made them hungry for touching, for licking, for feeling a rush of air-conditioned currents on their naked limbs, so that when they went back home at the end of their vacation, they could say to their friends, yes, the Dominican Republic truly is paradise. I'm so happy I got away. Snap out of it. The parents might call for their child any moment. Elena redialed Laura, let the line ring again, again, again. She eventually tried her office line instead. Laura Moreno, Laura said in a sophisticated tone. It's me, Elena said. What? Laura was annoyed. You've got to come to her room now. Calm down. What happened? There's been an accident with La Muchachita from Penthouse 7. So that's the opening of the book. That's the first chapter. And now I'm going to read just a couple of pages from a different section with another one of their employees. This is a section that comes, the first section I read to you happened on Thursday, and now I'm gonna read to you a section that happens the next day on Friday. And the only thing that you need to know is that the little girl that was, this is not a spoiler, the little girl who was injured in the first section, she's fine. And Pablo is driving her family and the little girl across the Dominican Republic from one resort to like a sister resort that is on the other side, closer to the border with Haiti. And on the way there, they have a quite frightening incident that happens to the in their car. And so at this point, they've just arrived at this other resort. And so I'm just gonna read a little bit to you from that section. Just one second. So like I said before, Pablo and his girlfriend Vida have broken up. And so you just need to know that he has been heartbroken for like the last day and a half as we follow him around the resort. For the first time in many days, Vida was the furthest thing from Pablo's thoughts. When he and the tourist family reached the presidential suite at the Yellow Paloma Resort, Pablo pretended familiarity with the babysitter that worked there as he made introductions to put this nerve-wracked family at ease. He understood his job in a deeper way. At the Grand Paloma Resort, they had been trained on how to go about rescuing someone's stay. And he'd often assume that would be necessary after someone had fallen ill due to undercooked or contaminated food, or had an unpleasant encounter with a local outside of the resort. But as the babysitter rushed to get the little girl into a swimsuit and they headed out to the water park, the parents didn't move off the couch. Neither had taken a step toward the balcony to stare at the approaching pink sunset, nor had they inquired about their spa credits or asked Pablo to schedule their treatments. They both sat on the couch, not speaking, not moving, obviously waiting for him to leave them alone. Pablo understood that it would be disastrous for them to speak to each other about what had just happened without him there to help them reframe it. Rescuing their stay meant rescuing the resort. Because it wasn't just this couple that would likely never return to the Grand Paloma Resort or to this island, but everyone in their circle. Each time the experience was revisited, it would become more grotesque, incalculably scarier. Soon enough, the mere mention of the Dominican Republic, of the Caribbean as a whole, would evoke in this family and their friends a vision of gunslinging children, ready to city of God any tourist who dare set foot on their land straight to hell. Pablo understood that he had a small window in which to act, influence, correct their narrative. Thank God that just then they were too shocked to tell him to go. Pablo felt a momentary respite from his loneliness, from the heartbreak he'd been battling. He, an ambassador, was responsible for safeguarding the sanctity of his homeland. What did he have at his disposal? Only a diamond-rated playground called a resort and his body. Pablo called downstairs, asked for 2 pitchers of palomas to be brought to the room, along with an extra bottle of mezcal on a serving tray with all the ingredients to keep the party going. The drinks came insanely fast. He just turned on some Maluma and, hoping for some subliminal messages, played Borró cassette. He unbuttoned his shirt and served them all shots. Pa abajo, pa arriba, pa fuera, pa dentro. Without pressuring the couple in any way, Pablo began to dance, moving his hips, and with the infectious energy of a good beat, he actually began to feel better. The drinks did their work. The wife's face flushed red. The husband removed his Gucci loafers. Her shoulders started moving from side to side with surprising spot-on rhythm. Pablo gestured to the husband, asking if it was okay for him to ask the lady to dance. By way of a response, the husband leaned his athletic body backward and spread his arms on the oyster boucle couch to watch. Pablo kept a respectable distance from the woman who kept breaching it. She turned away from him and dug her ass into his groin. Coughing, Pablo moved away from her, extended a hand toward the husband to join them. The husband narrowed his gaze, a soft, surprised smile playing on his features as he stared at his drunk wife. He shook his head at Pablo, made some motion with his arms to indicate that they should keep dancing, and stood up. How about another round of shots? The husband said. The wife removed her oversized cotton button-down shirt after she took that shot. Underneath it, she wore a delicate silk camise, the color of the inner curve of a seashell, the color of her tongue as it wetted her lips. She wasn't wearing a bra. Her nipples were erect from dancing, maybe from desire. Pablo was astonished when she leaned close enough to him that he could feel those hard buds through the soft fabric. He was even more stunned when she leaned up and kissed him, full on the lips. It happened so unexpectedly that Pablo kissed her back without a thought. It was a few seconds before he came to himself, stepping away from her, bracing himself for the husband rising off the couch and punching him on the jaw. But when he looked at the white couch, the husband was gone. The wife pulled Pablo to her, once again biting his bottom lip, taking his hand in hers and slipping it under that soft camise. to touch her soft, barely there breast. He let his body do what it knew to do, easily discarding the shirt, pinching her, returning the bite on her shoulders, leaving a trail of spit as his tongue took that little bud and flicked it. That trail raised delicious goosebumps on her skin. Sophie moaned. From down the hall, Pablo heard the husband's voice call out to them both. Come to bed, the husband said. The wife walked ahead, leading the way. She threw her arm back, the pinky of her left hand a hook, all those diamond rings on her ring finger sparkling under the overhead lights. The move was so coordinated that it seemed like she'd done it many times before. Pablo instinctively let his pinky strike hers. From somewhere far in the past, he could hear the ocean lapping against his old fishing boat. He ignored it. That night would prove to be the worst, most painful and humiliating sexual experience of Pablo's life. But just then, Pablo didn't know it. He merely thought, I can't believe I get paid for this. I can't believe this is my job. I'll stop there. Should we check to see if folks have some Q&A?
Well, and I have one question from one of my students. Come on up. Yeah, you don't have to come on camera. It's just, it'll be easier.
Is that gonna stop it from doing that ripple effect?
I just can't have them both on at the same time. Okay.
All right. Did Pablo, the wife, and the husband, they got busy, didn't they?
Oh,
If you haven't gotten to that point in the book, I'm not going to spoil it. You have to read on. Well, Pablo's been getting down with several tourists. That's a safe assumption.
okay. Any questions from the chat or anyone else? Okay, come on up.
So the characters in the story, are they based off someone that you personally know, or did you like, where did they really come from? Like, is that something you really had to work through and like develop? Or is this something that like hit in a dream or?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you. So I think in terms of like what inspired the characters, you know, there were like a lot of different touch points for me with the characters. I would say that, you know, Vida, who is the curandera, was largely inspired by my mother. You know, my mother is definitely not someone that would call herself a curandera, who is a healer in our culture. But my mom is definitely someone who had to teach herself how to like do a lot of holistic healing because my older sister was born with sickle cell anemia as a child. And, you know, when we were growing up in the Dominican Republic, there just weren't a lot of treatments or a lot of medicine. And so my mom, you know, from the time I was a child, I remember my mom just becoming really savvy and like learning about different plants and like, you know, different ways to keep my sister healthy. And then it's so interesting because when we moved, you know, when we immigrated to the United States, I was 10 years old, as Dr. Mungor said. And I remember, you know, my mom just became someone in our community that people would often go to ask about healing and like remedies. And then, you know, in our culture, in Dominican culture, in a lot of Latinx or Latina countries, people do limpias. So anytime that you're feeling unwell, and it doesn't necessarily mean a limpia like only if you're ill. Sometimes it's bad luck, or sometimes it's like your lover is cheating on you, or they've left you and you want them back. So you kind of do these cleansing baths in order to bring about like good luck or like some kind of healing. And so as I was growing up, you know, in like our 3-bedroom apartment in Harlem, I would hear my mom sometimes like whacking people with branches. And I would be like, what the hell is going on in there, you know? But whenever the people left, they would often feel like this lightness. And I could tell like they were in a better place than from when they came. And so I was thinking a lot, you know, in this book that is so centrally concerned with work and labor and class and privilege. I wanted one character who would be really kind of like pure and really connected to the ancestors and really connected to the earth, and who kind of understood that what a lot of the other employees are chasing, she's not someone who is concerned with those things. She's really concerned with kind of the earth and our connection to the earth. So I definitely feel like Vida, who is, you know, the woman that Pablo is heartbroken over, not that heartbroken, obviously, but, you know, he's heartbroken over her. That is one character that for me is really, was inspired a lot by my mom. And then, you know, the other thing that I did, once I had written the first draft of the book, is that I started interviewing a lot of people in the Dominican Republic. I travel back to DR every summer. And so I spent, and so that's part of the reason why the book is dedicated to like laborers and workers in the tourism industry, because I spent the last 3 years, every summer that I would go back to the Dominican Republic with my family, I would take time out to like interview migrants or laborers, and just to get a sense of what it was like. You know, I also interviewed a lot of people from like the Red Cross and like government employees to understand the humanitarian crisis that's happening right now between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So even though the rest of the characters in the book are definitely not inspired by real people, they are inspired by like information that I gathered through those interviews. And Pablo, you know, in particular, I was kind of shocked when I started interviewing Dominican men that worked in like these very high-end hotels, like to what extent there was like an expectation of sex work. Because I think a lot of women now are protected in those kind of spaces. And so I was just really surprised that, and not to say that like unpleasant things don't happen to women, because I think, you know, it's just the nature of the beast, that I also heard that there had been like unpleasant things. But the idea that there were like some of these male employees who were involved in sex work but were never paid, to me it was just so fascinating. This idea that it's like some kind of exploitation, but at the same time like the men are kind of choosing to take certain behaviors. So I was really fascinated by that, and that definitely made its way into the plot of the book. But yeah, I mean, it was really kind of juicy, interviewing people, sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes it was really uplifting, because I heard about a lot of the solidarity that exists in these kind of like tough work environments in the Caribbean hotel industry.
One of the questions from the chat is, what is your inspiration for this novel? You've touched on some of it, but is there anything you want to add?
Yes, I mean, I definitely want to add that, you know, one of the things that I learned when I was in college, when I was an undergrad, is that I read Edwidge Danticat's The Farming of Bones. And that book is a retelling, and it's a historical novel that takes place during the 1937 Parsley Massacre. And for any of you who aren't familiar, in 1937, the Dominican government mandated the army to massacre like tens of thousands of Haitian people in the Dominican Republic. And over the course of several days, I mean, tens of thousands of people were murdered. And when I first read that book, you know, I was in my 20s, and I was just about to graduate from college. And I just remember being really shocked that I had never heard about this massacre. Like I actually, like, you know, back in the day, we didn't have like Google on our phones. So I had to go to the library to find out if this was actually true. And I was shocked that it was true, that like this massacre had actually happened, because, you know, I was in the Dominican Republic until halfway through the 5th grade. I had never heard about it in school. I had several family members, my grandparents, you know, aunts and uncles who were quite older, and I had never heard about it in my community. And so it was the first time really that it occurred to me the power that literature had in a way to ensure that like the histories that sometimes are erased, whether intentionally or unintentionally, could be kind of archived in fiction. And it made me think a lot about what was happening every time I went back to the Dominican Republic, what's happening with Haitian people. You know, in the last 10 years, like Haitians, Dominicans of Haitian descent have lost their citizenship. And so in that first chapter, when Elena's talking about the paper she wrote, like the case against statelessness, that's what Elena's paper is about. It's about the crisis that happened where a lot of Dominicans of Haitian descent were stripped of their citizenship. And so, you know, there were other ways in which I wanted to animate history, but because the book is happening over 7 days and it's really meant to be a suspenseful book, I didn't want to use history and flashbacks or like include a different timeline. That's not what I was interested in doing. I really wanted to find a way to put like the history through the characters, through the town that is the local town where this resort is. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about like, how do I contribute to this conversation that I think has been happening in the Caribbean about post-colonialism and capitalism and like really the Caribbean as this beginning place between the old world and the new world and the creation of capitalism. Really, it's like that's where it happened. And so I gave a lot of thought and I was really inspired by Edwidge Danticat's book. And I was really inspired by Jamaica Kincaid's book, A Small Place. So those are the two epigraphs that I used to open the book, because I wanted anyone who picks up my book to understand that this book is also in conversation with these other books.
Okay, another question from the chat from one of my colleagues who is a published novelist as well. What is your advice for a writer who is stuck in the middle of writing a novel and can't seem to progress forward?
Oh my goodness. This is like thank you for that question, because I have to tell you, I advise graduate students who are either like at the beginning of the MFA and then sometimes I'm their thesis advisor. And I think, you know, I feel like maybe because I failed so many times with my first book, because my thesis, you know, I wrote a thesis as part of my MFA that was never published. And that book, I spent a couple of years writing it, rewriting it. And then when it didn't sell, I just like put it in a drawer and started working Neruda on the Park. And then Neruda on the Park ended up being like a 15-year journey from like first sentence to publication. And so what I tell my students now, you know, is that I don't think that you should pause as you're writing your first draft of your book. I don't think that you should revise as you go, which is, I know it's very difficult for some writers, but I'm a big believer in just finishing the first draft. And sometimes the reason that people get stuck in a first draft is because they either lose inspiration, right? They get kind of bored and they don't know where the story should go. And so what I usually tell my students is to like switch perspective. You might not keep that on the next draft, but if you're writing the story from a certain perspective and then all of a sudden you feel kind of stuck and you don't know what else is happening or it's not interesting to you anymore, then try to take another character and give the narrative to another character to move it forward. I find that sometimes, like when we get blocked as writers, it usually has more to do with us than the narrative. Like usually it's either because we're feeling like this is a bad idea, I'm a terrible writer, like this is never gonna go anywhere. And I would just say, like, you have to kind of like get out of your own way. I mean, everybody's first draft is terrible. And that's why you have to write it as quickly as possible. Like, get it over with. You know what I mean? Like, it's like fast forward to the end. Because I do think that like so many of the revelations that we have about characters and about plot, those revelations happen only when you get to the end of the story. I mean, sometimes you're like, oh, I want to write a story about these employees in this resort, and they're all making these terrible decisions one after the other. But really, it isn't until the end of this draft that I was like, oh, this book is is actually about freedom. This book is actually about made family versus, born into family. This book is really centrally concerned with the legacies of colonialism and what's happening in the Caribbean. So, some of those ideas, I feel like if I had gone into the book being like, I want to write about these big ideas, I would have been paralyzed because, you can't write about ideas. You have to write about people. And so those are some of the things that I do when I get stuck. I try to change perspective, change character. If I'm bored, then everybody else that reads the book is going to be bored too. So I try to think about something that's a little bit more interesting or something delicious, even if I feel like I might have to cut that out in another draft, but just to entertain myself. And then sometimes that kind of gives me more energy, to put more energy into the book.
Okay, awesome. We have another question from one of my students. So it is known that we don't control our own characters. What is the wildest thing one of yours has done?
Well, I have to tell you, like, these characters in this book are terrible people. I mean, I feel like, and I knew that because, when I started writing the book, it was the pandemic. And I felt like I just wanted to escape my life. Like, my little children were so tiny, and like virtual school was terrible. Nobody knew what the hell was going on with Zoom. And so I had like a first grader and a third grader, and it was just tough times. My husband and I both worked full time, and it was like, the first few days, I felt like our employers gave us a break, but then very quickly we realized that there was no end in sight. And then all of a sudden, like the corporate machine was like, your productivity needs to be the same. And so it was really impossible situation to be in, both as an employee and then as a human being, right? And so I think that maybe because I also had like that full manuscript hanging over my head. Like I kept thinking like, oh my God, what if this is yet another book that never makes it out into the world? I think so much of like what the characters in the Grand Paloma Resort are concerned with is like escape. Like they're all trying to escape their circumstances for the most part. I mean, there are a couple of characters that don't have that, but certainly the protagonists, Elena and Laura, that's their main desire is that they want to like escape this resort, leave the island. And so yeah, I think like so much of what I've been thinking about and like I kept thinking about as I was writing this book was really about like giving these characters like freedom to be terrible people. And I really also wanted to like be subversive in a way because sometimes I feel like, especially when I read Caribbean literature, there's this kind of like morality that some writers give poor people, like, oh, poor people always have the high ground. And I actually think that it is quite difficult for people who do not have, like financial stability, familial stability, to make the good choices or make the right choices sometimes. I mean, if you're afraid to lose your job, you're gonna do whatever your job is asking you to do. And so I'll say this because I don't want to spoil the book for those of you who might be interested in reading it. But there were certain times in this book where even though I'm the one writing it, I was like, oh, like I would gasp at like Laura and Elena because they were making choices that were just absolutely unforgivable. And so, one of the things that I started thinking about once this kind of like, their moral compasses were just broken. And I wanted to explore like why were they making these kind of terrible choices? And so that led me to like a deeper understanding of them and like their backstories. But also I think really importantly for me, I was thinking a lot about how in like the highest levels of our society, right? The people who are doing the biggest, right? And the widest spread wrong, like, and I'm talking about genocide, massacres, right? And thinking about the history of my country, like those people that like commanded tens of thousands of people to be murdered, like they're never brought to justice, right? Like a lot of times, like I know in my own country, a lot of those war crimes those people were never brought to account. And so I also wanted to think about complicity, like how sometimes when you're like looking at the person who's making the day-to-day wrong choice, we are so hard on those people. And then like the people who are doing bigger wrongs, they seem to like become less significant to us. And I'm also really fascinated by that, by this idea of forgiveness and how sometimes we become more lenient with people because we're like, of course they're not gonna be paying for their mistakes, right? It's kind of absurd to expect it. And then when someone does something that in the bigger scheme of things is unforgivable, but it's kind of like a smaller scale mistake, I sometimes wonder about how a reader would grapple with that. And I wanted to offer that as a way to think about forgiveness and think about who really gets to be forgiven in our society for the mistakes they make.
Okay, those are some really good questions, and I think this question about the wildest thing one of your characters does is a question inspired by a question I have, in that I see that a lot of Dominican writers, even to this day, like there's still the presence of Trujillo in some way in their works. So do you see Trujillo in any way as an inspiration, or is he a part of your novels?
Well, I mean, I think that the legacy, right? I mean, I definitely feel, at least for me, you know, Trujillo never by name is not in this book, but certainly the Parsley Massacre is in this book. And then the legacy of what's happening to Haitian people in the Dominican Republic becomes very important to the characters as the book progresses and we understand the history of the town. So I certainly think that like one of the reasons why I think so many of us are haunted, right? And now I'm thinking about Juno Diaz, I'm thinking about Julia Alvarez, who has written about it, Nelly Rosario, Angie Cruz, right? So many of us have this part of like our history as an inspiration point, because like I don't think that our country has healed from it. And I do think that as writers, a lot of times what ends up haunting us, like as you look around in our society, right? Like what are the ways in which you feel like history keeps itself present in the present day? And so that's one thing that I would say, like for us, and this is a conversation I've had with many of these writers that I've mentioned. Some of them I know intimately as friends, some of them I know as colleagues, and I certainly think about and talk about that all the time, how like when a country hasn't healed from some of like its biggest, most unforgivable acts, then I think that looms in the consciousness of like all its people. And of course, we as artists and as writers are just kind of like tuning into that and animating it in our work. So I definitely do think that he is someone that most of us think about, if not directly, then indirectly in the way that we are kind of trying to address the present moment.
Does anyone else have any questions that's in the Zoom chat that they want to ask? So this has been a very engaging and fantastic evening so far. I guess I can ask one more quick one, or one of my students has a question, okay?
I wanted to ask was, had you, before you actually published any of these novels, had you shown people in your family or in like your close circle before putting them out there? That's what I wanted to know.
No, I mean, I hadn't
Your
shared.
thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. No, I hadn't really thought about, well, first of all, let me start by saying that, I've been working on a memoir for like probably the better part of the last 7 years. And I did ask like my sister and my mother if it would be okay to write about our lives, because in our lives there was a lot of violence, there was like a lot of abuse, that happened in my home. And so I knew that I wanted to write fiction and nonfiction. I know that I wanted to publish some essays. And when I wrote, parts of like the more painful parts of my childhood, I did like ask my mother and my sisters and my brother who lives in the Dominican Republic for permission. And they all gave me permission and I interviewed them. And some of those essays, I've published. And so, you know, my family, it's really interesting though, because with my fiction, um, you know, I have like a writing group from my MFA program, and then I have several like trusted readers that I share early drafts of my work with. And so when it comes to like sharing work, I usually only share it for like craft. Like if I'm gonna give it to somebody, it's because I want someone to read it and give me feedback so I can make it better. But I think for me, I feel more of an obligation, honestly, to like share my intention with my family. And so I just had a piece that was published over the summer for Modern Love, and it was so crazy because when I started writing that essay, it was going to be about me and my sister because we both happen to have you know, my sister, like I said, my older sister was born with sickle cell anemia, and then my son was born with sickle cell anemia. And so I ended up going through, like, my son went through 2 bone marrow transplants by the time he was 4 years old, and my daughter was the donor. And so there were like all these crazy things that I saw as parallels. And so, like, last summer, I started thinking, oh, I really want to write an essay. And then it was kind of wild because like over the Christmas break, like last winter break, my older sister's daughter had a stroke, and she's only 37 years old. And we found out actually that she has this degenerative brain disease. And that had, you know, just we don't know why it all of a sudden you know, started affecting her, but she had like 4 strokes in you know, in a matter of months, and had to have open brain surgery. And anyway, so then I started thinking about like, oh, this essay, I had asked my sister for permission to write just about like sickle cell anemia and like the way that it had affected both of us. But then when everything happened to her daughter, I was like, oh my God, now it's like the way that like motherhood has shown up for us as siblings. And you know, my family, I mean, I have to say I'm very fortunate because my sister right away was like, absolutely write it. I sent her the essay. That essay I sent to my sister before I sent it. And also like Modern Love, they get like 10,000 essays a month. So I was like, it's such a fat chance that this essay is gonna get chosen. But I knew that, you know, maybe it would be chosen. So I sent it to my sister. And you know, it was so sweet because she wrote me back and she was like, oh my God, this made me cry. And like, I just don't even know how you remember. Because, you know, I was writing about us as children. And she was like, I don't even know how you remember that. Like, things that happened to us when we were like 10 years old. And so, in a way, it was like kind of, I cried as I was writing that essay. It was like a really tough essay to write. And so, you know, depending on what the topic is that you're writing about, I think it can be a really good idea to share your work with your family. I do think you have to be prepared that sometimes people are awful, and that, you know, I have also had that experience in my family where people have read my work, not my immediate family, but extended family, and they have had big problems with the fact that I write about violence and I write about sexual abuse. And so, you know, I think that you have to be really sure that you want the feedback from people, because sometimes when you give someone your work, in some ways what you're asking is for permission, and you have to be prepared that some people might say, absolutely not, I don't want this in the world. And what are you going to do then? So, you know, my big thing is, you know, I want to protect my mother and my siblings. And so like whenever I write about our personal life, I want to make sure they're okay with it, right? Because like you never know the backlash you're gonna get from extended family or friends. And as long as they're okay with it, then I can deal with like extended people being shady, or, you know, or taking having a lot of problems and issues with me. Like I'm okay with that. So I would just say, like, just be very intentional about who you share with, and like go into it with like a clear sense of why do you want them to read it? Excuse me.
Okay. Our last question, what are you working on now? And I see on your Instagram, it says you have an untitled project coming in 2027.
Yes, I mean, this is like, I feel like a Cinderella because I had such a tough time selling my first book. It was like I went from my 20s to my 40s trying to like stand up a writing career. And now my next book, I sold it. And like I sold it as an outline. I mean, it's a miracle, really, how little, oh my God, look at that dog, Kelly. I love it. Like, no, I love it. We got like a visitor here. So I just want to say that yeah, I mean, for anyone that's thinking about writing creatively or has like a novel, I know my dear friend Sabe is working on a beautiful book that I can't wait for that book to be out in the world. But just don't give up, because sometimes, like, I know I was facing like relentless rejections for decades of my life. And now things are, so much better. So I sold this third book as an outline. The book is part of the Grand Paloma Resort universe, but it's going to be different employees at different island in the Caribbean. And that book is about centrally concerned with like medical tourism. I'm really interested in thinking about the Caribbean as a place where like wealthy people hide their money. And so I just started interviewing like financial people, and I'm learning so much about the way money works, which is kind of like shocking. I don't even know how it's gonna make its way into the book, but I'm just now doing a lot of research. And so that book is slated to come out in 2027. So it's gonna be a really different experience working under pressure. Wish me luck.
Okay, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Deb Casey of Wor-Wic Community College's president to see if she has any remarks she wants to give to close.
Hello. You can hear me okay?
Yes, hi, President Casey. How are you?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Listen, I want to thank you, Professor Natera, for doing this for us. It means a lot. I'm wondering if you're interested in a TV series, because I think season 4 of The White Lotus should be the Grand Paloma Resort.
Well, listen, I love the White Lotus. People keep
Yes.
talking to me about it because when they read it, they're like, "This should be one." And
Seriously.
so, fingers crossed, right? Because they, when they reviewed the book in the New York Times, the reviewers said this made her think about. So I'm like
Yes.
hoping that the creators and the writers are reading it. Wouldn't that be a hoot? If
I know. I think when you were speaking before you did the first reading passage, I really felt that, it reminded me of the stories that have been in the different seasons. So I really appreciated just your sharing about the Dominican Republic's history and the environment. You made it come to life. And I really think that's an important part of picking up something and reading it and saying, wow, this really, I'm connected to this in some way. And I think I'm really excited myself to pick it up and read it. So maybe when David's done, he'll share it with me, because I think I'm really interested in how you captured the post-colonialism and the capitalism, especially related to the workers at a luxury resort like that. I think that's really something intriguing to read more into. And I really think it's hard, as you said, to really write something that talks about exploitation and privilege, especially in the Caribbean. And so that courage and the risk that you took to do that, I really appreciate that you came to Wor-Wic to tell us more about you personally and about sharing your personal experiences, how they connected with your book writing. That meant a lot. So thank you for being part of Wor-Wic in our community tonight. It means a lot.
Oh my God. Thank you, President Casey. And thank you to Dr. Mungor, because, I knew that it was going to be kind of nonstop since August, because I already had so many different events lined up, but I couldn't pass up a chance to work with someone who's, a former colleague from Montclair State and who studied at Montclair, because I'm teaching there. And our students are just like my heart. They're just wonderful, bright students. And I love being able now to go back to the English department and be like, look at this, like success. So thank you, Dr. Mungor, for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. So thanks everyone for coming. I just want to remind everybody about the next couple of readings for the series. So on Tuesday, October 21st, we're having horror writer David Viergutz. On Monday, November 3rd, we have Native Alaskan and Inupiaq writer Luli Tuzroiluk. And on the 13th of November, which is a Thursday, we have Pulitzer Prize winning poet Tahimba Jess to wrap up our series for this semester. So thanks again, Cleyvis, for coming. It was a pleasure and a great read. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you, Dr. Mongor. Good job.